Russia today is the largest country on Earth, and one of the most influential in human history. Despite this, the earliest origins of this massive nation are often neglected. This is certainly not for lack of interesting stories, as the cast of people that feature in early Russian history are nothing short of colourful. Welcome to our first video in our series on the history of Russia, where we will cover the ancient origins of this most enigmatic land. For millennia, the grassy plains of the Ukraine and southern Russia, the Ponto-Caspian steppe, had been inhabited by a diverse caste of hardy nomadic people thriving along the Don, Dnieper and Volga rivers. The first written accounts of this land date back to classical antiquity in the 7th century BC. During this time, the steppe was dominated by various tribes of Iranian origin, the most prominent being the Scythians and Sarmatians. The ancient Greeks, who had a smattering of cities along the shore of the Black Sea, recorded stories about the nomads who lived to the north. Herodotus relates a tale that claims the Scythians were born of a union of the demigod Hercules and a serpent woman. Meanwhile, the Sarmatians were known for the legendary strength of their women, and therefore were considered a product of mixing between the Scythians and mythical Amazonian warriors. More historically reliable accounts describe these Iranic pastoralists as a sturdy people who lived and died on the backs of their steeds, subsisting on horse milk and meat, while enjoying the pleasures of psychoactive herbs and undiluted wines. For centuries, their domination of the steppe would be near unchallenged, but further to the north, a young and ambitious tribe was finding its bearings. These, of course, were the Slavs. The true origins of the Slavs are shrouded in mystery. The earliest written accounts of their existence come from Roman sources. In the 1st century AD, the senator and historian Tacitus described a tribe he called the Venedi, a people who lived primarily along the Vistula River. Tacitus noted that they built homes, carried shields, and fought unmounted, distinguishing them from their nomadic Sarmatian neighbours. Dismissed as yet another barbarian people by the classical civilizations, the Venedi were most likely the progenitors of all of today's Slavic nations. For centuries, these Proto-Slavs were hemmed in by their powerful Celtic and Germanic neighbours to the west, and Scytho-Sarmatians to the south. This changed between the 4th and 6th centuries as a great migration took place, with the Huns and various Germanic peoples migrating into the borders of the collapsing Western Roman Empire. Broadly speaking, this enormous migration allowed the early Slavs to expand beyond their original homeland in all directions. By then, the Venedi had diffused into numerous distinct branching tribes. Some tribes crossed the Danube into Eastern Roman territory, seizing lands for themselves in the Balkans and becoming the forebears of the South Slavs. Some tribes ventured westward into the domain of the Avars. There they carved a home for themselves and became the eventual predecessors of the Western Slavs. Most important to our story are the tribes who went eastwards into modern Ukraine. The Scythians and Sarmatians, who for centuries had dominated the steppe, were weakened by centuries of war with the Goths, Romans and Huns. The Proto-Slavs sunk their roots into this unstable region, eventually assimilating the last remnants of these ancient peoples. While we know little of this eastern migration, it is evident that in the following decades, Slavic peoples would continue to expand across much of modern Ukraine, Belarus and central western Russia, intermixing with various clans of indigenous Finno-Ugrics and Baltic peoples, the ancestral cousins of Lithuanians, Latvians, Estonians and Finns. By 750 AD, the Eastern Slavs occupied land from Lake Ladoga in the north to the coast of the Black Sea. While they shared a common language and culture, the Eastern Slavs were not politically united, divided into many tribes that operated on complex kinship ties. They tended to avoid the high ground, settling along rivers and lakes where water was abundant. There they built strongholds with enclosed earth and timber ramparts, wooden walls and an external ditch. These bastions were often surrounded by various peripheral villages, which provided grain and livestock. Not much is known about the native religion of the early Slavs, Other than that, they held to a pantheon of gods resembling those of their Indo-European cousins. The most well-attested to of these is Perun, their god supreme, wielder of thunder and lord of the sky. His eternal foe was Veles, ruler of the underworld, associated with magic, shamanism and sorcery. There were of course many other deities, embodying fertility, fire and the passing seasons, among other things. Pagan Slavs saw their gods as being tied intrinsically with the untamed wilderness in which they lived, and built their shrines in oaken groves. It should be noted that early Slavic society is reconstructed primarily through later Christian writers who looked upon their pagan forebears with disdain. Nevertheless, some information can be passed from the sources available to us. For example, the law of hospitality was the most sacred of rites to tribal Slavs. All guests were cherished without exception, and any tribe who mistreated an itinerant traveller would be attacked by neighbouring tribes for their dishonour. War was not uncommon, both with the Balts and Finns and amongst the Slavs. They avoided pitched battles, instead fighting in dense woodlands with ample cover, while using short iron spears, heavy wooden shields, and bows nocked with poison-tipped arrows. The lives of the early Eastern Slavs were decentralized and chaotic, yet there was order and harmony through their shared customs. Nonetheless, things were soon to change, as new arrivals came from the north on the decks of dragon-headed longboats. At the turn of the 9th century, the Scandinavian peninsula had a burgeoning population. In a cold, mountainous climate, good farmland was a rarity. This pushed the Norsemen to sail from their homes seeking new lands. Generally speaking, the Danes went westwards, where they became known to the English and French as Vikings. The Swedes, however, ventured to the east, where they quickly discovered the mighty rivers spanning down the continental mainland. By sailing down the crucial waterways of Eastern Europe, the Norsemen became deeply engaged in the trade networks that had existed in the region for centuries. At the confluence of the Kama and Volga, they encountered the Bulgars, with whom they traded furs, wax and honey in exchange for silver. Occasionally they rode further upriver and traded with the Khazars, whose control over the steppe had granted them rule over an incredibly wealthy land of diverse peoples, including many Slavic tribes. Meanwhile, those who sailed up the Dnieper soon found themselves in the Black Sea, and before long, the Eastern Roman capital of Constantinople. They called this splendorous place Miklagard, literally meaning the Great City. According to Roman sources, the Norsemen laid siege to the imperial capital in 860, striking like a lightning bolt from heaven, before ultimately being forced to retreat after a storm destroyed their fleet. With that said, the Romans were made to accept the Varangians as partners in commerce, making them wealthy with silks and wine. War and trade helped the Norsemen prosper, and that wealth meant they were there to stay. Of course, flying down the great rivers meant that the Norsemen inevitably passed through the Slavic territory. The Slavs called them Varangians or Rus, terms likely derived from the Old Norse words meaning pledged companions and the people who row. Initial interactions between them were hostile, as the Norsemen often raided Slavic villages, exacting tribute and taking slaves to trade in the southern markets. Within a few decades, the Scandinavians dominated not only the Slavs, but Finns and Balts as well. It would be this intersection of cultures that would give rise to the first united ruling dynasty in Russian history, the Rurikids. Before we explain the rise of the Rurikids, we should note that much of early Russian history is known through the Primary Chronicle, written in the year 1113 AD by a monk, Nestor. While his works are considered the most valuable source of knowledge on this era, the legitimacy of his work is often called into question by modern historians. Still, the Primary Chronicle presents the only complete story moving forward, and its tale will be the one presented by us. According to Nestor, the Slavs, Finns and Balts revolted against their Scandinavian masters at some point before 860 AD, driving them back across the Northern Sea. Evidently, the Norsemen had been something of a stabilizing force in the region, for once they had been expelled, the Slavic tribes quickly devolved back into habitual warfare with themselves and their neighbours. The chronicle had this to say: "There was no law among them, but tribe rose against tribe. Discord thus ensued among them, and they began to war against one another. They said to themselves, 'Let us seek a prince who may rule over us and judge us according to the law.' They went overseas to the Varangian Ruses, and said to the people of Rus, 'Our whole land is great and rich, but there is no order in it. Come to reign and rule over us.' The prince invited by the Slavs was named Rurik. Promptly accepting their offer, he settled amongst his new people in 862. Rurik established his capital on the Volkhov River, likely on the site of an older Slavic stronghold. His city soon grew to become a prosperous hub of riverbound trade, and became known to the Slavs as Novgorod. For 17 years, Prince Rurik worked to stabilize his realm, establishing laws and formal tributary rulership over the many native tribes of the region. He died in 879, leaving his realm to his kinsman Oleg. By all accounts, Oleg was the classic embodiment of a Viking warrior, an ambitious prince who sought to expand his lands through conquest. To that end, he turned his gaze upon the Great Khaganate to the south. Ruling the crossroads of an international trading hub, the Khazars were naturally tolerant of the many tribes and religions in their domain. In one of history's more peculiar twists, the Turkic rulers had even converted to Judaism. Among their tributary subjects were the majority of the Eastern Slavic tribes in the south. For centuries, the Khazars prospered in their steppe land. Oleg, however, was not a foe to be trifled with. He had all the tribes of the north united under him, and commanded a vast army comprised of Norse, Finnic, and Slavic warriors. According to Nestor, Oleg sailed his army up the Dnieper River in 882, seizing the towns of Smolensk and Lubeck en route. Before long, they arrived upon the wooded hills of Kiev, an ancient outpost most likely founded by Eastern Slavic migrants as early as the 5th century. By the time of Oleg's arrival, Kiev was a vassal of the Khazars and was ruled by the Norse warlords Askold and Dir, who evidently were the ones behind the Varangian attack on Byzantium back in 860. Oleg is said to have confronted his fellow Norse rulers, decrying them boldly, saying, "You are not princes, nor even of princely stock, but I am of princely birth." Askold and Dir were promptly slain, and Oleg took firm control of Kiev. He was quick to see the value of this town. Kiev was surrounded by fertile soil, and its position along the Dnieper River gave it the potential to be a heart of trade and commerce. Oleg declared himself the Prince of Kiev, and decided it would be from there he would rule the rest of the realm. Soon he ventured on, wresting more Slavic tribes from Khazar control. By 885, the prince had united the vast majority of the Eastern Slavs under his rule. It is here that the Kievan Rus was born, a nation that would survive for 3 centuries and grow to become among the most prosperous in medieval Europe. Kiev was its grand capital, from which the descendants of Rurik and Oleg ruled as princes of the Rurikid dynasty. While Rus originally referred to the nation's ruling Scandinavian elite, in time, all the tribes of the Kievan realm, whether Slavic or Nordic, simply came to be known as the people of the Rus. Through fate and conquest, the Rurikid princes had given their names to the land, which Russia, the land of the Rus, retains to this day.